In chapter 13, we're going to be talking about fiscal policy. So we've established that we're living in a Keynesian world, right? So we know that when things go wrong with the economy, we expect the government to step in and do something to fix it. So what we're looking at in this chapter is what the government can do in terms of government spending and taxation. So our objectives for this chapter are to identify and explain the purpose, tools, and limitations of fiscal policy, explain the role of built-in stabilizers in moderating or flattening business cycles, summarize recent U.S. fiscal policy and the projections for U.S. fiscal policy over the next few years, discuss the problems that governments may encounter in enacting and applying fiscal policy, and then we're going to talk about the public debt. So let's begin by just making sure we understand what fiscal policy is. So we're talking about deliberate changes in government spending and taxation. So fiscal policy is not all government spending and taxation, but it is, again, things that are undertaken deliberately to achieve full employment and to control inflation and encourage economic growth. Okay, so we often refer to this as discretionary fiscal policy. So by discretionary, what we mean is that these changes are made at the option of the federal government. So we're going to be talking later about automatic stabilizers, and those are things that just happen without requiring action by Congress. So in order to understand fiscal policy, we have to understand some basics of how government spending works. And so one of the things we have to talk about is a budget deficit. A budget deficit occurs when government spending is greater than tax revenues. So think about tax revenues. We think about taxes as things we pay, but taxes are also income to the government. So the government runs a budget deficit when they spend more than they have coming in. But they can also run a budget surplus if they spend less than they have coming in. And believe it or not, the government has run surpluses in the past. So there's two types of fiscal policy. There's expansionary fiscal policy, and then there's going to be contractionary fiscal policy. So expansionary fiscal policy is, as its name implies, something that is undertaken to expand the economy. So we're going to use it during a recession. Usually the problem in a recession is that aggregate demand is too low. Or remember, we've moved over into that recessionary gap, so real GDP or output is less than it should be. So the ways we can use fiscal policy to kind of help pull us out of a recession is that we can increase government spending, because that will increase aggregate demand and shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, or we can decrease taxes. Now, taxes is a little bit trickier because taxes does not have a direct effect on aggregate demand. Taxes has an indirect effect. So remember, what was our primary determinant of consumption spending? It was disposable income, right? And disposable income is personal income minus personal taxes. So that's where the majority of the connection comes in here. We also have a connection to investment spending because we know that businesses will make their investment decisions based on after-tax profit. So taxes will change that. So if we decrease personal taxes, then disposable income goes up. If disposable income goes up, consumption goes up. If consumption goes up, aggregate demand goes up. Or if we decrease business taxes, we know that investment will go up, and if investment goes up, aggregate demand goes up. Okay? So we can increase government spending, which directly increases aggregate demand because it's one piece of it, or we can decrease taxes, or we can do both. And that's usually what we do. Okay? The catch here is that expansionary fiscal policy will create a deficit, right? Let's think about this. If we just increase government spending and we don't increase taxes to go along with it, that's going to create a deficit. If we just decrease taxes and we don't also decrease government spending to go along with it, that will create a deficit. And the fact that usually we're doing both at the same time, increasing government spending at the same time that we're decreasing taxes, so tax revenues are going down, it's definitely going to create a deficit. So, does that mean we shouldn't enact expansionary fiscal policy? No. I think our experiences during the Great Recession and the COVID recession would tell us we definitely, want expansionary fiscal policy. But we just have to be mindful that this is where a lot of our deficits come from. So this is what it looks like. So again, we're looking at a level of GDP of 490 when we know we want to be at 510. 510 is what we would consider to be our natural level of GDP or potential level of GDP. That's where our long run aggregate supply curve would be located if we had it on this graph. So we've got a GDP gap of $20 billion, right? We're at 490, we want to be at 510. So again, a couple different ways that the government could do this. They could increase spending or they could decrease taxes. So what we're showing here is a $5 billion initial increase in government spending. So that gets us to the dash line. And then remember, the multiplier takes over and will move us the rest of the way and give us the full $20 billion increase in aggregate demand and move us back to where we want to be. Isn't that nifty? Okay. Now, if we were doing this with taxes, it's going to take a little bit higher amount in terms of the decrease in taxes, again, because of an indirect effect. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So that was expansionary fiscal policy. On the other hand, we've got contractionary fiscal policy. And we're going to want to use contractionary fiscal policy when we're experiencing demand pull inflation, right? Remember, with demand pull inflation, we're spending too much. Too much spending chasing too few goods. So aggregate demand is too high. So the appropriate measures to take when aggregate demand is too high would be to A, decrease government spending, because that's a direct effect on aggregate demand. If we decrease government spending, then aggregate demand should decrease and the aggregate demand curve should shift to the left. Or we could increase taxes, because if we increase taxes, disposable income goes down. If disposable income goes down, consumption goes down. If consumption goes down, aggregate demand goes down. Or if we're talking about business taxes, if business taxes go up, then profits go down. If profits go down, the rate of return goes down. And so, the expected rate of return goes down. And so we would expect to see investment go down, and therefore aggregate demand would go down. Or again, we could do both. Okay? But again, here's the other thing about contractionary fiscal policy. It will create a surplus. If we decrease government spending and don't change taxes, surplus. If we increase taxes and therefore increase tax revenues without changing spending, surplus. And if we do both, then we're definitely going to create a surplus. Okay? Now let's think about this for a minute. Hopefully you recognize we've been talking about it kind of all semester. We think we've been experiencing demand pull inflation, right? We've been experiencing these pretty high rates of inflation, and all we've been hearing about is the Federal Reserve. We haven't heard anything about contractionary fiscal policy. Well, what we're going to find once we also talk about monetary policy is that we do now kind of live in a world, particularly with contractionary fiscal policy or when we're in that inflationary gap, that we do tend to look much more to the Federal Reserve to handle that than to Congress and the President. And if you think about it, kind of should make sense, right? What did we talk about with expansionary fiscal policy? We talked about increasing government spending or decreasing taxes. Both of those are pretty popular, right? If we increase government spending, we feel like, oh, the government's taking care of us. And if we decrease taxes, yay, right? But think about decreasing government spending or increasing taxes. Those become highly controversial things, right? So contractionary fiscal policy is not as, what's the word I want to use? It's not as popular. It's not really used as much. So certainly when we're in an inflationary gap, we're going to tend to look more to monetary policy. We're going to tend to look more to the Fed, as we have been doing right now. All right, here's what contractionary fiscal policy would look like. Again, we want to be at 510, but instead we're at 522. The economy's gotten overheated, and we see that we've gotten inflation because of that, right? We've gone from P1 to P2. Okay, so our GDP gap is $12 billion from 510 to 522. So the government could decrease spending by $3 billion. That would pull $3 billion directly out of aggregate demand. Then we let the multiplier take over, and that would give us the full $12 billion decrease in aggregate demand. But here's the problem. Remember we talked about sticky prices, and again, this is another reason why contractionary fiscal policy really isn't used as much. Because we would normally say, okay, when aggregate demand shifts from AD4 to the left, then, real GDP will fall and the price level will fall and everything's good, right? Except we know the price level doesn't really fall. So because of that, contractionary fiscal policy tends to be a lot more difficult to dial in. Because the price level doesn't fall, we might actually end up at a point like point D. Because the price level doesn't fall, we actually overshoot our target. Okay, so again, the bottom line here is that contractionary fiscal policy is not used nearly as much as expansionary fiscal policy is. All right, so let's go back and talk a little bit about those multipliers. Okay, so we talked about the multiplier, the spending multiplier, back in chapter 10. Now we're going to call it the government spending multiplier because that's what we're talking about in this chapter. Okay, so that's our hopefully familiar 1 divided by 1 minus in the MPC. Or remember, we can also state that as 1 divided by the MPS. But now we're also going to make a distinction and have a separate tax multiplier. And the tax multiplier is going to be the MPC divided by 1 minus the MPC. Now, what I want you to understand is that the tax multiplier is not a completely different animal, okay? It's just another version. Because remember we talked about the fact that taxes have an indirect effect on the aggregate demand when we're talking about fiscal policy. It's because they first have to affect disposable income. Okay, that's the primary way that we think about it. So let's say that we decrease taxes by $5 billion. That increases disposable income by $5 billion, but it doesn't increase aggregate demand by $5 billion, does it? Because when we change disposable income, we're going to change consumption and we're going to change savings, right? So not all of the change in disposable income becomes a change in consumption. And it's the change in consumption that affects aggregate demand, not the change in disposable income. So the idea is that first you would have to multiply that change in disposable income by the MPC to figure out how much of that becomes a change in consumption. And then it's the change in consumption that you would multiply by the multiplier, right? So let's say that the MPC is 0.75, okay? So if you had a $5 billion increase in disposable income, then 75% of that is going to become new consumption. So you'd have $3.75 billion in consumption. That's what would get hit against the multiplier. And if the MPC is 0.75, the multiplier is going to be 4, right? So we would take 3.75 times 4, and that would get us an increase of 15 billion. But if we had just increased government spending by 5 billion, that's a direct injection into aggregate demand. So that would get multiplied times the multiplier. That would give us an increase in GDP of 20 billion. So we get a bigger bang for our buck out of government spending than we do out of taxes because some of that change in taxes will go away to savings, and that does not affect aggregate demand. So that, in effect, is why we have a separate tax multiplier. But what I want you to see is the tax multiplier is just taking care of that intermediate step for us. Remember, we took that change in taxes and we had an equal change in disposable income, and we multiplied it times the MPC, didn't we? Well, that's what we're accomplishing by putting the MPC at the top of this multiplier. Okay, So the tax multiplier is still the same multiplier. It's still the same process. It's just shortcutting the process for us a little bit. Okay, so that's all it is. All right, let's do a little practice here. So if the MPC is 0.75 and the government spending multiplier is what? Well, it's just our normal multiplier. It's 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. So that's going to be 4. The tax multiplier, on the other hand, we have to stick the MPC on the top of that, so it's 0.75 divided by 1 minus 0.75. So the tax multiplier is 3. So the government spending multiplier will always be higher than the tax multiplier. We're always going to get a bigger bang for our buck out of government spending than taxes. Okay, so we've got two options. We can change government spending or we can change taxation. What do we do? Well, it's kind of interesting because it turns out that the choice does have a little to do with politics. And by politics, I mean primarily what we think about the size of government and the role of government. So let's say that you're someone who is concerned about unmet social needs, or you think that we have a lot of aging infrastructure that really needs to be repaired or replaced. And you know, if you're of that mindset, and we say here on the slide to expand the size of government, so you are in favor of the government taking care of these things. Well, if we're in a recession, your choices are going to be to increase government spending or decrease taxes. Well, again, if you're worried about unmet social needs, then you're going to want to increase government spending because that government spending can go to directly affect those who need the help. Or if you're concerned about infrastructure, that government spending can actually be spent on our aging infrastructure. Your other option in a recession is to decrease taxes. Well, who is that going to help primarily? Primarily, a decrease in taxes will help the wealthy, not the ones who are at the bottom of the scale. And a decrease in taxes is not going to do anything to get your roads repaired. Okay? So if we're in a recession, then you're likely to choose to increase government spending. But if we're in an inflationary situation and your choices are to decrease government spending or increase taxes, well, think about it. You're not going to want to decrease government spending because, again, that's going to take money away from those with unmet needs. It's going to take money away from these infrastructure projects that perhaps you're concerned about. And if we increase taxes, that burden is going to fall primarily on the wealthy, those who maybe don't need the help, right? So first of all, I want you to recognize that here's a flip-flop, right? But the flip-flop makes sense. Now, if instead you're one who believes that the government is too large and inefficient, that we need to trim the fat, so to speak. If we're in a recessionary gap and your choices are to increase government spending or decrease taxes, then you're likely to choose to decrease taxes because that gives the government less money to play with, and it's going to force them to be more efficient. But if we're in an inflationary gap and your choices are to decrease government spending or increase taxes, well, you're not going to want to increase taxes because, again, that will give the government more money to play with and will cause it to get bigger. So you're going to choose to want to decrease government spending because, again, that will reduce the size of government. So again, here's a flip-flop. So again, two things. First of all, the policy choice a lot of times comes from your feelings about the size of government and the role of government. But then it also is going to depend on which problem that we're dealing with. A lot of times politicians get criticized for flip-flopping, right? Well, here's an example where flip-flop, if you think about it, actually makes sense.